Baby found a bear cub locked in a music store. Sound booth. What he did next, hit the right note. The rain started falling just as Ethan Marshall pushed the stroller around the corner of Maple Street. His wife Jessica walked beside him, her hand resting protectively on their 10-month-old son Connor's tiny shoulder as the baby gurgled happily, completely unbothered by the sudden change in weather. The drops came down harder, faster, turning from a gentle patter into steady sheets that soaked through Ethan's jacket within seconds. They needed shelter, and they needed it now. That's when Jessica spotted it, an old music store tucked between a closed bakery and an antique shop, its faded sign reading Harmony's Haven in peeling gold letters. The door stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for them. Ethan pushed the door open with his shoulder, maneuvering the stroller inside while Jessica shook the water from her hair. The store smelled of old wood and forgotten melodies, dust motes dancing in the dim light that filtered through grimy windows. Rows of instruments lined the walls, guitars hanging like sleeping bats, violins nestled in velvet cases, and in the center of it all, an ancient grand piano that seemed to watch them with its open lid like a great black eye. Connor made a soft cooing sound, his chubby fingers reaching toward the piano as if he could feel something they couldn't. The silence in the store felt heavy, expectant, like the pause between musical notes waiting to be played. "Strange that it's open, but nobody's here," Jessica whispered, her voice barely disturbing the thick quiet that wrapped around them like a blanket. She walked deeper into the store, her footsteps creaking on the old wooden floor, each sound seeming to echo longer than it should. Ethan followed with the stroller, noticing how Connor had gone unusually quiet, his bright blue eyes fixed on something in the back of the store. The baby's usual babbling had stopped completely, replaced by an intense focus that seemed impossible for someone so young. Then they heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, barely audible but definitely there, coming from somewhere behind the wall of drum kits and amplifiers. The sound repeated itself, tap, 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 3 notes in perfect time, like someone playing the world's quietest song. Ethan felt the hair on his arms stand up, not from fear, but from something else, something he couldn't quite name. Jessica had already started moving toward the sound, drawn by the same invisible thread that seemed to be pulling all of them deeper into the store. Behind a stack of dusty keyboard boxes, they found a door they hadn't noticed before, painted the same dark color as the wall, with a small window at eye level. Through the glass, they could see it was a sound booth, the kind used for recording, with foam padding on the walls and a single overhead light casting shadows in strange patterns. Connor suddenly laughed, a bright, delighted sound that broke through the tension like sunshine through clouds. His tiny hands clapped together as he bounced in his stroller, pointing insistently at the booth's window. Ethan leaned closer to look through the glass, and what he saw made him step back so quickly he nearly knocked over a music stand. Inside the booth, sitting on a small stool in front of an old, upright piano, was a bear cub. Not a toy, not a statue, but a living, breathing bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, its dark fur catching the light as it lifted one paw and brought it down on a single piano key. The same note, over and over, creating that rhythmic tapping they'd been hearing. "That's impossible," Jessica breathed. But she was already reaching for the door handle, her maternal instincts overriding her common sense. The door was locked, a heavy padlock hanging from the latch, looking newer than anything else in the store. The bear cub must have heard them because it turned its head, and Ethan found himself looking into eyes that held more intelligence than any animal's should. They weren't the blank, instinctual eyes of a wild creature, but eyes that seemed to recognize them, to have been waiting for them. The cub made a soft sound, not quite a growl, more like a sigh, and turned back to the piano, pressing the same key again with deliberate precision. "We need to get it out," Jessica said, her voice firm with decision. She was already examining the lock, testing its weight, looking for another way in. Ethan wanted to argue, to suggest they call animal control or the police, but something about the whole situation felt different from any normal emergency. This wasn't a dangerous situation that needed official intervention. It was something else entirely. Something that belonged just to them and this moment. Connor seemed to agree, reaching his arms toward the booth with such determination that Ethan had to hold him back from climbing out of the stroller. The lock wasn't actually locked, they discovered. It was just hanging there, closed but not secured, as if someone had wanted it to look locked without actually preventing entry. Jessica slipped it off carefully, the metal cold in her hands, and pushed the door open slowly. The bear cub didn't run or panic. Instead, it turned on the stool to face them fully, and that's when they saw the collar around its neck. Not a regular pet collar, but something that looked handmade from woven silver threads, with a small pendant hanging from it. The pendant bore a symbol neither of them recognized, something that looked like a musical note combined with a constellation, etched in metal that seemed to shift colors as it caught the light. Connor made a sound of pure joy, his whole body wiggling with excitement as Ethan carefully lifted him from the stroller. The baby reached toward the bear cub with no fear whatsoever, and incredibly the cub moved closer, sniffing the air delicately. They met in the middle of the small booth, baby and bear, and Connor's tiny hand touched the soft fur with a gentleness that surprised even his parents. The cub made a rumbling sound, almost like purring, and nuzzled against Connor's palm. In that moment, the three adults, for the bear cub somehow seemed like an adult in its own right, formed a circle of understanding that needed no words. "Look at the piano," Ethan whispered, noticing something they'd missed before. The key the cub had been playing wasn't random. It was marked with the same symbol that appeared on the collar's pendant. The marking looked old, worn into the ivory by years of repeated touching, but still clearly visible. When Ethan pressed the key himself, the note that rang out seemed different from what a piano should produce, fuller, richer, as if it contained harmonies within harmonies. The cub watched him intently, then placed its own paw next to Ethan's finger, pressing the key again, and this time the sound was even stranger, even more beautiful. Jessica had found something else, a notebook tucked behind the piano, its pages yellow with age but the writing still legible. The first page contained only a single sentence. "Music is the language that needs no translation." The rest of the pages were filled with musical notations, but not standard notes. These were symbols that matched the one on the collar and the piano key, arranged in patterns that seemed to tell a story without words. As she turned the pages, the bear cub moved closer, watching the notebook as if it recognized what was written there. Connor had settled into a peaceful contentment, sitting on the floor of the booth with one hand still resting on the bear cub's back. The cub had curled up beside him, and they looked for all the world like two children who had always known each other, who had been waiting their whole lives for this reunion. Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes, though he couldn't say why. There was something so profoundly right about this moment, as if puzzle pieces he hadn't known were missing had suddenly clicked into place. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that seemed to match the breathing of everyone in the small booth. "We can't just leave it here," Jessica said softly, voicing what they were all thinking. But even as she said it, they all knew this wasn't about taking the cub anywhere. This was about something else, something the notebook might explain if they could understand its language. Ethan sat down at the piano properly, studying the marked key and the symbols in the notebook. As a musician, he'd always believed that music could communicate beyond words, but this was something entirely different. These symbols seemed to be instructions, or maybe an invitation, written in a language that predated any human musical notation. The bear cub stood up suddenly, moving with purpose to the piano. It placed both paws on the keys and began to play. Not randomly, but an actual melody, simple but hauntingly beautiful. Its paws moved with impossible dexterity, finding notes that created a tune that seemed both ancient and timeless. Connor laughed and clapped, bouncing with excitement, and without thinking, Ethan placed his hands on the keys too, following the cub's lead, adding harmony to its melody. The music that filled the small booth was unlike anything he'd ever played or heard, each note seeming to resonate not just in their ears, but in their bones, their hearts, their souls. Jessica noticed it first. The walls of the booth were beginning to shimmer, the foam padding seeming to ripple like water. The overhead light flickered, not failing but changing, becoming softer, more golden, like sunset light filtering through leaves. The music continued, Ethan and the bear cub playing together as if they'd rehearsed this piece 1,000 times, and Connor's happy babbling provided a kind of percussion, a joyful counterpoint to the mysterious melody. The symbol on the collar was glowing now, actually glowing with a soft blue light that pulsed in time with the music. "Don't stop," Jessica whispered, though she wasn't sure why she said it. She could feel something building, something important about to happen. The notebook in her hands had grown warm, and when she looked down she saw that the symbols on its pages were glowing too, the same soft blue as the collar. The whole booth felt alive with possibility, with magic that had been sleeping until this exact moment, waiting for the right combination of souls to wake it up. Connor reached up and grabbed his mother's hand, his tiny fingers surprisingly strong, and she knelt beside him and the bear cub, completing their small circle. The music reached a crescendo, and the back wall of the booth simply dissolved, not violently but gently, like morning mist burning off in sunlight. Beyond, where the wall had been, was not the rest of the music store but a forest glade, bathed in moonlight despite the fact that it was afternoon and raining in the world they knew. The trees were silver birches, their white bark glowing in the ethereal light, and the ground was covered in soft moss that seemed to pulse with its own gentle luminescence. The bear cub stood up, looking back at them with those intelligent eyes, and took a step toward the forest. "It's going home," Ethan said, understanding flooding through him all at once. The cub hadn't been trapped. It had been waiting for someone who could help it find the door between worlds. The music had been the key, but not just any music. It had needed the pure, untainted joy of a baby's laughter, the love of parents, the understanding of a musician, all combined with its own ancient knowledge. Connor waved bye-bye, his chubby hand opening and closing, and the bear cub paused at the threshold between the booth and the forest. It came back just for a moment and pressed its nose against Connor's cheek in what could only be described as a kiss. Then it touched its paw to the piano one more time, playing a single note that hung in the air like a promise. The collar around its neck loosened and fell to the floor, and Jessica picked it up, feeling its surprising lightness. The symbol on the pendant was no longer glowing, but it was warm to the touch, like it had been lying in sunshine. The bear cub gave them one last look, a look that said thank you and goodbye and maybe even until we meet again, and then it bounded into the forest, disappearing among the silver trees. The wall began to reform, slowly, giving them time to understand what they had witnessed. The forest didn't disappear all at once, but faded gradually, like a dream upon waking, until only the foam padding of the sound booth remained. But something had changed. The booth felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight that had been pressing down on it for years had finally been lifted. The piano's marked keys still glowed faintly, but as they watched, that too faded to normal, leaving only the worn symbol as evidence of what had happened. Connor yawned, suddenly tired from all the excitement, and snuggled into his mother's arms. The collar was still in Jessica's hand, real and solid, proof that they hadn't imagined everything. The notebook, too, remained, though its pages no longer glowed. Ethan played the melody again, or tried to, but it sounded like regular piano music now, beautiful but ordinary. Whatever door they had opened was closed again, at least for now. They sat in the booth for a long moment, none of them wanting to break the spell by speaking, each processing what they had experienced in their own way. The rain had stopped, they realized, and sunlight was streaming through the store's windows, casting rainbows through the water droplets still clinging to the glass. The store itself looked different in this light. Less abandoned, more like it was simply resting, waiting for its next movement. Connor was almost asleep, his breathing deep and regular, one small fist clutching the collar's pendant. Jessica and Ethan exchanged a look that said everything and nothing. A look that acknowledged that their world had just become infinitely larger and more mysterious than they had ever imagined. "Should we tell anyone?" Jessica asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But even as she asked, she knew the answer. This was their secret, their miracle, their moment of magic in an ordinary world. Who would believe them anyway? A bear cub that could play piano, a door to another world opened by music. A baby who showed no fear of the impossible. It sounded like a fairy tale, the kind of story people told children to help them believe in wonder. But they had lived it, breathed it, been part of it, and that was enough. Ethan carefully closed the piano's lid, his fingers lingering on the wood as if saying goodbye to an old friend. The notebook he tucked into Connor's diaper bag, knowing that someday, when Connor was older, they would show it to him and tell him about the day he helped a magical bear cub find its way home. The collar Jessica wrapped in a soft cloth and placed in her pocket, where it seemed to pulse with warmth against her hip. They gathered their things slowly, reluctant to leave but knowing they couldn't stay forever in this place between worlds. As they wheeled the stroller back through the store, Ethan noticed something he hadn't seen before. Photographs on the walls, old and faded, showing the store in its heyday. In one, a young woman sat at the grand piano in the center of the store, and around her neck was a necklace with a familiar symbol. In another, a man stood by the sound booth, and if you looked closely, very closely, you could see something in the booth's window behind him, a small, dark shape that might have been a bear cub, or might have been a shadow, or might have been a trick of the light. The door closed behind them with a gentle chime, and when Ethan turned to look back, he wasn't entirely surprised to see that the open sign had flipped to closed, though no one had touched it. The store seemed to settle into itself, returning to its patient waiting, keeping its secrets safe until the next time someone needed to find magic in an ordinary afternoon. Connor stirred in his stroller, opened his eyes briefly, and smiled at something only he could see. Then he settled back into sleep, his tiny hand still holding tight to something invisible, something precious, something that connected him forever to a world beyond the one most people knew. They walked home in comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun warming their faces, the puddles from the rain reflecting the sky like scattered mirrors. Other people passed them on the sidewalk, joggers, dog walkers, other parents with strollers, and Ethan wondered how many of them had experienced their own moments of impossible magic. their own doors to other worlds. Maybe everyone had these stories locked inside them, these encounters with wonder that they kept secret because they were too precious to share with a world that might not understand. Jessica started humming as they walked, and Ethan recognized it immediately. It was the melody the bear cub had played, the one he had harmonized with, the one that had opened the door. She was humming it perfectly, every note exactly right, even though she had never been particularly musical before. Connor's breathing seemed to match the rhythm of the tune, and Ethan found himself humming along, their voices creating a soft symphony that followed them home. A passing sparrow landed on the stroller's canopy, tilted its head as if listening, then flew away, carrying the melody into the sky. That night, after Connor was asleep in his crib, Jessica and Ethan sat together on their couch, the collar and notebook between them on the coffee table. They didn't need to talk about what had happened. They had been there together, had shared every moment of it. Instead, Ethan picked up his guitar from the corner where it had been gathering dust for months and began to play. Not the magic melody that seemed to exist only in that particular moment and place, but something new, something inspired by their adventure. Jessica curled up against him, her hand resting on the collar, feeling its gentle warmth. "Do you think we'll ever see it again?" she asked, meaning the bear cub, the forest, the magic, all of it. Ethan's fingers paused on the guitar strings, and he considered the question carefully. In his heart, he felt certain that this wasn't an ending but a beginning, that the door they had helped open was not gone, but simply closed for now, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Connor would grow up knowing that the impossible was possible, that music could unlock worlds, that love and innocence and joy were the most powerful magic of all. "I think," Ethan said slowly, "that magic like that doesn't just happen once. I think it plants seeds that grow in ways we can't imagine yet. Maybe we won't see that exact bear cub again, but I believe we'll recognize the magic when it comes back to us in a different form." He played a soft chord, and somewhere in the baby monitor they could hear Connor sigh contentedly in his sleep. The collar on the coffee table seemed to pulse once with light, so briefly they might have imagined it, and then was still. Days passed, then weeks, and life returned to its normal rhythm. They didn't go back to the music store, though they walked past it sometimes, and it was always closed, looking exactly as abandoned as it had the day they'd taken shelter there. But things were different in small, almost imperceptible ways. Connor seemed more aware than other babies his age, his eyes tracking things that weren't there, his laughter coming at odd moments as if someone invisible was playing with him. Ethan's music had changed too. There was a depth to it now, a resonance that made people stop and really listen when he played. Jessica found herself drawing symbols in the margins of her notebooks at work. Symbols she didn't remember learning, but that felt familiar under her pen. When she compared them to the notebook from the music store, she found they matched perfectly. It was as if the knowledge had been planted in her mind, waiting to bloom when the time was right. She started researching the symbols, finding hints and traces in ancient texts about music as a universal language, about doors between worlds, about beings that existed in the spaces between notes. One evening, as autumn turned the leaves gold and red, they were having dinner when Connor, now starting to say his first words, pointed at the window and said clearly, "Bear." They looked, but saw nothing, just the darkening sky and the first stars beginning to appear. But Connor kept pointing, smiling his special smile, the one he'd worn in the sound booth. "Bear home," he said, and then went back to eating his mashed carrots as if he hadn't just spoken his first complete sentence. That night, Ethan had a dream. He was back in the sound booth, but this time he was alone. The piano was playing by itself, the keys moving without anyone touching them, creating a melody even more beautiful than the one they had played that day. The back wall was transparent, and through it he could see not just one forest, but dozens, hundreds, each one slightly different, each one connected by threads of music that vibrated with their own unique frequencies. The bear cub was there, grown larger now, standing on its hind legs and conducting an orchestra of creatures he had no names for, beings of light and shadow and everything in between. When he woke, he found Jessica already awake, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You saw it too," she said, not a question but a statement. They had shared the dream, experienced the same vision of infinite worlds connected by music. Connor was standing in his crib, reaching toward the ceiling, babbling happily in what sounded almost like singing. The collar on their dresser was glowing softly, and the notebook's pages were turning by themselves, revealing new symbols, new songs, new doors waiting to be opened. They understood then that their adventure in the music store had been just the first note in a much longer composition. Connor was special, marked somehow by his encounter with the bear cub, chosen perhaps to be a bridge between worlds. As he grew, he would need their guidance, their love, their protection, but also their willingness to believe in the impossible. The bear cub had not just been going home that day, it had been showing them that home was bigger than they had ever imagined, that family could include beings from other worlds, that love transcended the boundaries of reality. Ethan picked up Connor, who immediately grabbed for the collar, holding it with a grip that suggested he knew exactly what it was and what it meant. Jessica opened the notebook to a page they hadn't seen before, one that showed a map of sorts. Not of places, but of moments. Intersections where the worlds touched and music could open the way. There were dozens of marks on the map, some in their city, some scattered across the globe. Each mark pulsed with its own rhythm, its own potential for wonder. "We're going to have quite the adventure, aren't we?" Jessica said, touching one of the marks that seemed to call to her. It was located in a park not far from their home, a place they'd walked through 100 times without ever suspecting it might be special. Connor clapped his hands and laughed, the collar chiming softly in his grip. Outside, the stars seemed brighter than usual, and if you listened carefully, you could hear music in the wind, the same melody that had opened the door, calling them to new discoveries. The next morning was Saturday, and without discussing it, they all knew where they were going. The park was quiet in the early morning light, mist rising from the pond, ducks gliding across the water leaving ripples that caught the sun. They found the spot marked in the notebook easily. It was a grove of trees they'd never really noticed before, though it must have always been there. In the center was a stump, worn smooth by weather and time, and carved into its surface was the familiar symbol. Connor wriggled to be let down from his father's arms, and when his tiny feet touched the ground, the symbol began to glow. Not dramatically, not with the intensity of that day in the music store, but gently, like a greeting between old friends. They heard it then, music coming from somewhere and nowhere. A different melody this time, but clearly related to the first, like movements in the same symphony. The trees around them shimmered, and for just a moment they could see through to another place, another grove where other beings stood watching them with curious, friendly eyes. A small creature, not a bear this time, but something that looked like a cross between a rabbit and a bird, hopped through the shimmer. It was no bigger than Connor's teddy bear, with soft gray fur and wings that sparkled like starlight. It approached Connor fearlessly, and he sat down on the grass to meet it at eye level. They studied each other with the serious concentration of children making friends, and then the creature made a sound like a bell, laughing, and Connor giggled in response. The connection was immediate and complete, another thread in the tapestry that was being woven around their family. "This is just the beginning," Ethan said, watching his son play with a creature from another world as naturally as if it were a neighborhood puppy. Jessica nodded, her hand finding his, the notebook tucked under her other arm. They were guardians now, not just of Connor, but of something larger, a secret that connected worlds. A responsibility to keep the doors open for those who needed to cross through. The collar in Jessica's pocket hummed with warmth, and she knew that somewhere, in that moonlit forest, the bear cub remembered them too. As the sun climbed higher, the shimmer faded, and the creature gave Connor what could only be described as a hug before hopping back through the closing door between worlds. Connor waved goodbye, then turned to his parents with an expression of perfect contentment. "More," he said clearly, pointing to the notebook. "More friends." And they knew he was right. There would be more. More doors, more music, more impossible meetings that would expand their understanding of what the universe could hold. They spent the morning in the park, playing and picnicking, but also planning. The notebook was not just a record, but a guide, and they were its keepers now. Each symbol represented not just a place, but a need. Somewhere, someone, there were beings who needed help finding their way home, or finding their way here, or simply finding connection across the vast spaces between worlds. Connor, with his innocent joy and fearless love, was the key that could unlock these meetings. They were his protectors and guides, but he was their teacher, showing them how to see with wonder instead of fear. As they packed up to leave, an elderly woman approached them, moving with the careful grace of age. She looked at Connor, then at the notebook visible in their bag, and smiled a knowing smile. "I had my own encounter many years ago," she said softly. "A fox that played a flute, if you can believe it. Changed my whole life, made me understand that the world was so much more than what we see." She touched Connor's cheek gently, and he smiled up at her. "You take care of this special one. He's got important work to do." Before they could respond, she was walking away, but she turned back once and added, "The music store opens when it needs to. Remember that." Then she was gone, vanishing into the paths of the park with surprising speed for someone her age. They looked at each other, understanding that they were part of something that had been going on for much longer than they'd realized. A network of people who had glimpsed the magic and kept it safe. That evening, as they put Connor to bed, he insisted on holding the collar while he slept. They watched him for a moment. Their miracle child who had brought magic into their lives not through his own power, but through his pure, unconditional acceptance of it. The bear cub had recognized something in him, something that made him a perfect ambassador between worlds. As they closed his door, they heard him humming in his sleep, the original melody, note perfect, a lullaby that crossed dimensions. Downstairs, Ethan took out his guitar again and began to write. Not just music, but a story, their story, though he would change the details enough that people would think it was fiction. Jessica worked beside him, translating the symbols from the notebook, finding patterns and meanings that revealed themselves slowly, like flowers blooming in time-lapse photography. They were documenting something important, creating a record for Connor when he was older, and perhaps for others who might need to know that magic was real and accessible to those who approached it with open hearts. The collar sat between them on the table, no longer glowing, but always warm, a tangible reminder of that afternoon when their ordinary walk had become extraordinary. Sometimes, if they looked at it from the corner of their eye, they could see the bear cub's reflection in its surface, playing piano in an endless loop of joy. They knew that somewhere, in that moonlit forest, The cub was grown now, maybe with cubs of its own, teaching them about the strange, wonderful humans who had helped it find its way home. Weeks turned to months, and their secret life of magic continued alongside their normal one. They visited each marked location in the notebook as Connor grew strong enough to walk on his own. Not every place opened its doors. Some seemed to be waiting for the right time, the right need, the right song. But when the doors did open, the meetings were always profound. A butterfly the size of an eagle that painted colors in the air. A school of fish that swam through the air as if it were water, their scales chiming like bells. A tree that grew backwards into the ground and spoke in whispers that only Connor could fully understand. Each encounter left them changed, expanded, more aware of the infinite possibilities that existed just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. Connor grew into a remarkable child. Not precocious exactly, but deeply wise in a way that had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with understanding. He made friends easily, not just with children, but with animals, with plants, with the wind itself. Other parents remarked on his calming presence, the way upset children would quiet when he was near, the way dogs would sit peacefully at his feet even if they were usually hyperactive. The music store remained closed whenever they passed it, but they knew now that it would open again when the time was right. The elderly woman from the park became a regular presence in their lives, though she never spoke of magic directly again. She would simply smile knowingly when Connor showed her a drawing of his friends that no one else could see, or when he hummed melodies that seemed to make the flowers in her garden bloom brighter. She was a guardian, too, they realized, one of many scattered throughout the world, keeping watch over the thin places where worlds touched. One day, when Connor was 3 years old and speaking in full, complex sentences that sometimes contained words from languages that didn't exist in this world, he asked them a question that stopped them cold. "When do I get to go to the forest? The bear wants to show me something." They exchanged glances over his head, wondering how he knew, what he remembered from that day when he was just a baby. But Connor just smiled his special smile and went back to playing with blocks that seemed to stack themselves when no one was looking directly at them. That night, they had the shared dream again, but this time, Connor was with them, standing between them in the sound booth that existed in the space between sleeping and waking. The bear was there, fully grown and magnificent, and it bowed to Connor as if greeting royalty. "Soon," it said, though its mouth didn't move. The word simply appeared in their minds like a remembered song. "When the moon sings and the stars dance, the door will open both ways." Connor reached out and touched the bear's nose, and for a moment they could see all the connections, all the threads that linked every living thing across all the worlds, a web of light and music that was beautiful beyond description. They woke to find Connor standing by their bed, the collar glowing in his hands. "Tomorrow," he said with certainty, "the store will be open tomorrow." And somehow they knew he was right. The notebook confirmed it. Tomorrow was a convergence, a rare alignment when multiple doors could open at once. They spent the day preparing, though they weren't sure what they were preparing for. Ethan tuned his guitar and practiced the melodies they'd learned. Jessica packed a bag with water and snacks, as if they were going on a trip. Connor simply played and laughed, occasionally pausing to listen to something only he could hear. The next afternoon they stood in front of Harmony's Haven, and just as Connor had predicted, the door was open. The interior looked exactly as it had that rainy day years ago, but also completely different. The instruments on the walls seemed to breathe with life. The piano in the center gleamed as if it had just been polished, and the air itself hummed with potential. Connor ran ahead, straight to the sound booth, where the door stood open, waiting. Inside, the piano bench was pulled out, and on it sat a piece of sheet music they'd never seen before, written in the familiar symbols. "This is it," Connor said, his young voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. "This is the song that opens all the doors at once, but we have to play it together. All of us, and the bear and everyone who's been waiting." He placed his small hands on the piano keys, and Ethan understood. This wasn't just about their family anymore. This was about creating a permanent connection, a bridge that wouldn't close, a way for the magic to flow freely between worlds for those who needed it. Ethan picked up his guitar, which had somehow appeared in the booth though he hadn't brought it. Jessica found a violin in her hands, an instrument she'd never played but suddenly knew how to use. The elderly woman from the park was there too, though they hadn't heard her arrive, holding a flute that looked like it was made of crystallized moonlight. Others began to appear, people they'd never met but recognized as fellow guardians, each carrying an instrument that called to them. Connor began to play, his tiny fingers finding notes that shouldn't have been possible for a child his size to reach. The melody that emerged was all the melodies they'd learned combined into something greater, a symphony of connection that made the walls of the booth transparent, then invisible, then gone entirely. They were standing in a space that was all spaces at once: the music store, the moonlit forest, the park grove, and dozens of other locations, all superimposed like a double-exposed photograph. The bear appeared, walking on its hind legs now, and it placed its paws on the piano beside Connor's hands. Together, they played a duet that was both simple and infinitely complex, each note creating ripples that spread outward through all the worlds. Other beings joined them: the rabbit bird, the painting butterfly, the speaking tree, creatures of every description, all adding their voices to the growing symphony. The music wasn't just sound anymore, it was visible, tangible, alive, weaving connections that would last forever. "This is why we met," Jessica said, though her lips didn't move. In this space, thoughts were shared directly. To help Connor build this bridge, to make the magic accessible to anyone who needs it. Ethan nodded, his guitar singing harmonies he didn't know existed. The elderly woman's flute soared above it all, a silver thread that tied everything together, and Connor, their beautiful, magical child, conducted it all with the confidence of someone who had been born for this exact moment. When the music finally ended, though in another sense it never ended, just transformed into something that would always be there, humming beneath the surface of reality, they were back in the sound booth. But it was different now. The walls still stood, but they were permeable to those who knew how to look. The piano remained, but it was more than a piano. It was a gateway that would always be available to those who needed it. And Connor, their 3-year-old son who had just conducted a multi-dimensional symphony, looked up at them with eyes that held the wisdom of ages and the innocence of childhood in perfect balance. "Now, everyone can find their way home," he said simply. "And home can be anywhere you're loved." The bear cub, for it had returned to its younger form for this goodbye, nuzzled Connor one more time, then walked through the wall as if it were mist, returning to its forest, but also never really leaving. The collar in Connor's hand had transformed too, becoming a simple bracelet that he could wear always, a reminder and a key and a promise all in one. As they left the music store that day, they saw the world differently. The connections Connor had helped create were visible if you knew how to look, threads of light and music connecting every living thing, creating a network of magic that anyone could access if they approached it with an open heart. The store would remain open now, they knew, not always physically but always spiritually, a beacon for those who needed to find the magic in their lives. Their story had become part of a larger story, one that had been unfolding for centuries and would continue long after they were gone. Connor would grow up to be a bridge builder, a connector of worlds, a teacher of the impossible. But for now, he was just their little boy, tired from his big adventure, falling asleep in his father's arms as they walked home through streets that sparkled with invisible magic. That night, as they tucked him into bed, Connor looked up at them with sleepy eyes and said, "The bear says thank you. And it says, this is just the beginning." Then he closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, humming the melody that had started it all, a lullaby that echoed across dimensions, carrying love and wonder to all who needed to hear it. Jessica and Ethan stood in his doorway for a long moment, watching their miracle child sleep, knowing that their lives would never be ordinary again, and being perfectly, completely grateful for that gift. The notebook still sat on their coffee table, but its pages were no longer fixed. New symbols appeared regularly, new songs, new doors waiting to be discovered. They had become part of an ancient tradition, keepers of wonder in a world that often forgot magic existed. And through Connor, through his pure heart and unlimited capacity for love, that magic would spread, touching lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The bear cub had been just the beginning, the first note in a symphony that would play forever, connecting all beings who were brave enough to believe in the impossible. As the moon rose outside their window, casting silver light across Connor's sleeping face, they could swear they heard it. Piano music, faint but clear, playing somewhere in the distance or perhaps in another world entirely. It was the bear, they knew, playing its part in the eternal song, reminding them that every ending was also a beginning, every goodbye a promise of reunion, every closed door an invitation to find another way through. And in his sleep, Connor smiled, his small hand closing around the bracelet that had once been a collar, holding tight to the magic that would always be part of him, part of them, part of the great, beautiful, impossible mystery of existence.